The funniest thing about failure is that it always shows up dressed as confidence. The laugh echoed across the ballroom before the champagne bubbles had time to settle. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light over hundreds of guests dressed in black suits and elegant evening gowns, but every head slowly turned toward the same spot near the center of the room. Ethan Brooks stood beside a high cocktail table, a glass raised casually in one hand and a smirk stretched across his face. His voice carried farther than he intended. Or maybe exactly as far as he intended. "Claire," he called out. "Wow. I almost didn't recognize you." A few guests glanced between them. Others immediately sensed the tension. Claire Bennett stopped beside a marble column near the edge of the ballroom. The navy blue dress she wore was simple compared to the designer label surrounding her, but it fit her with effortless elegance. She looked calm. Too calm. Ethan laughed lightly as if sharing an inside joke with the room. "Still coming to events like this, huh?" Several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. The music continued, but softer now, buried beneath curiosity. Claire offered a polite smile. "Nothing more." Ethan took another sip. "I figured after everything, you'd be somewhere quieter. Maybe a small town. Maybe hiding from all of us." A few nervous chuckles floated through the crowd. Claire kept her eyes steady. The ballroom smelled faintly of roses and expensive cologne. Somewhere behind her, silverware clinked against china. Every detail seemed unusually sharp. The way people watched. The way Ethan enjoyed being watched. The way his new confidence seemed to depend on an audience. "You know," Ethan continued, "I always admired your optimism." More laughter. "Life doesn't always work out the way we plan, does it?" Claire lowered her gaze briefly toward the champagne flute in her hand. Her reflection shimmered across the glass. Years ago, she would have answered. Years ago, she would have defended herself. Tonight, she simply stood there. And somehow that bothered Ethan more than any argument could have. He shifted his weight. "Nothing to say." Claire looked up again. "I'm just enjoying the evening." The answer landed softly, but it stopped the laughter almost immediately. Ethan forced another grin. "Good for you." The words sounded hollow. Across the ballroom, conversations resumed, but only partially. People were still listening. Still watching. Still waiting. Ethan wanted a reaction. Embarrassment. Anger. Anything. Instead, Claire remained composed. The same woman he once believed he understood now felt strangely unreadable. For a moment, an uncomfortable silence slipped between them. Ethan broke it first. "Well, I guess some people move forward faster than others." Claire nodded politely. "I suppose they do." The response was so simple that Ethan had nowhere to go with it. Around them, guests began whispering. Not about Claire. About the awkwardness growing around Ethan himself. The more he tried to appear superior, the more desperate he seemed. Claire noticed none of it. Or perhaps she noticed everything and simply chose not to engage. She took a small sip of champagne and glanced toward the ballroom entrance. Her expression changed for only a second. A subtle softness. A flicker of anticipation. Then it disappeared. Ethan followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual. Just another guest entering through the grand doors. A tall man in a tailored navy suit. Quiet. Unremarkable at first glance. The stranger paused near the entrance, scanning the room. His eyes settled on Claire. And for the first time that night, a genuine smile appeared on her face. The smile vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to pull Claire back through years she rarely allowed herself to revisit. The ballroom faded into a blur of crystal lights and polished marble as old memories surfaced with surprising clarity. There had been a time when Ethan Brooks was the center of her world. Back then, they lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment outside Chicago. The kitchen had outdated cabinets, the heating system rattled every winter, and the water pressure in the shower barely lasted 10 minutes. None of it mattered to Claire. She believed they were building something together. Every morning she left for work before sunrise. Every evening she returned carrying grocery bags, unpaid stress, and hope. Ethan had dreams that seemed bigger than their circumstances. He wanted success. Recognition. A corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Claire believed in those dreams almost as much as he did. She worked extra hours. She skipped vacations. She postponed plans she once had for herself because she thought sacrifice was part of love. Whenever Ethan doubted himself, she became his confidence. Whenever he stumbled, she became his support. She never kept score. She never asked for credit. She simply believed that one day they would stand together and look back on the difficult years with pride. At first, it seemed to be working. Ethan's career began moving upward. Promotions came. Better opportunities followed. The old apartment turned into a townhouse. The used sedan became a luxury SUV parked in the driveway. Friends congratulated them. Family members admired what they had built. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Success arrived quietly, but so did distance. Ethan stayed later at the office. Business dinners became more frequent. Conversations became shorter. The man who once shared every thought now guarded them behind polite smiles and vague explanations. Claire noticed it long before she admitted it to herself. There were empty chairs at dinner. Missed anniversaries. Phone calls that felt rushed. Promises postponed until another week, then another month. She kept telling herself things would improve once life slowed down. Life never slowed down. One rainy October evening, she sat alone at the dining room table waiting for him. The pot roast had gone cold. The candles had burned halfway down. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in steady rhythms. Ethan arrived nearly 2 hours late. His apology sounded practiced. His eyes never met hers for long. Something inside Claire understood the truth before he spoke it aloud. The marriage was already ending. The paperwork came months later. The silence arrived first. Friends chose sides. Invitations disappeared. People who once called regularly stopped calling altogether. Claire packed boxes by herself. She folded memories into cardboard containers and loaded them into the back of a rental truck. The hardest part was not losing the house. It was realizing how easily people forgot who had been there from the beginning. For a while, she questioned everything. Not because she missed Ethan, but because she missed the future she thought they were building. Yet somehow, she kept moving forward. One day at a time. One bill at a time. One sunrise at a time. And now, standing inside a ballroom filled with people who only knew the polished version of Ethan Brooks, Claire found herself strangely grateful for every difficult step that followed. Because the woman standing here tonight was not the same woman who had walked away years ago. She was stronger. Quieter. Harder to break. And as she looked once more toward the entrance, she realized the next chapter of her story was already walking into the room. Claire kept her eyes on the entrance long after the man stepped inside. The ballroom remained wrapped in soft conversation, but something had shifted. Not in the room. In her. It was the kind of feeling that arrives quietly, like the first hint of sunrise before anyone notices the sky changing color. The stranger moved through the crowd with an ease that felt natural rather than practiced. He was not trying to attract attention. In fact, he seemed determined to avoid it. While guests gathered around local executives, socialites, and business owners, he stayed near the edges of the room, exchanging brief greetings before continuing on. No grand entrance. No performance. No need to prove anything. Claire noticed because she had spent years around someone who always needed to be noticed. Ethan, meanwhile, was growing increasingly irritated. The reaction he expected never came. Claire had not defended herself. She had not left in embarrassment. She had not given him the satisfaction of seeing her uncomfortable. Instead, she appeared almost peaceful. That made no sense to him. He glanced toward a group of guests who had laughed at his earlier remarks. They were no longer paying attention. Some were speaking quietly among themselves. Others were watching Claire with curiosity rather than judgment. Ethan felt control slipping away without understanding why. "You seem different," he said suddenly. Claire turned back toward him. "Do I?" "You do." Ethan studied her face. "I expected this to be harder for you." The words lingered between them. Claire almost laughed, but not because they were funny. Because they revealed so much. Even now, after all these years, Ethan believed her story was somehow connected to him. As though her happiness required his approval. As though her future depended on his opinion. She looked around the ballroom. The chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of glasses and polished tables. A jazz trio played softly from a small stage near the back wall. Servers moved gracefully between guests carrying silver trays. Life continued. The world continued. And somehow Ethan still imagined himself standing at the center of it all. "A lot can change in a few years," Claire replied. Ethan shrugged. "I suppose." But his expression suggested he did not truly believe it. He was still searching for signs of regret. Signs of loss. Signs that she missed the life they once shared. Claire offered him none. Instead, her attention drifted again toward the stranger across the room. He had paused near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. For a moment, he stood alone, hands loosely folded in front of him, watching the lights beyond the glass. There was something calming about his presence. Familiar, even. Not because she had known him forever, but because some people enter your life without demanding anything from it. Those people are rare. Ethan noticed her gaze. "Friend of yours?" Claire hesitated. A small smile touched the corner of her lips. "Something like that." The answer immediately bothered him. His jaw tightened. "Interesting." Before Claire could respond, a woman from the event committee approached Ethan to ask a question about a sponsorship project. He forced a smile and followed her a few steps away. Yet even while speaking with her, his attention kept returning to Claire. He could not understand why she remained so composed. What he did not know was that the hardest years of Claire's life had already happened. The loneliness. The uncertainty. The rebuilding. She had survived all of it long before this evening began. A few seconds later, the stranger finally stepped away from the window. His eyes found Claire once more. Then he started walking toward her. Slowly. Calmly. As though he had all the time in the world. The distance between them was no more than 30 feet, yet it felt as though the entire evening had been moving toward that moment. Claire watched as the stranger crossed the ballroom floor with unhurried confidence. Guests stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. Conversations continued around him, but his presence carried a quiet gravity that was difficult to explain. He was not the loudest person in the room. He was not trying to impress anyone. Somehow, that made him stand out even more. When he finally reached her, a warm smile appeared in his eyes before it reached his face. "I was beginning to think you might leave before I got here," he said. His voice was calm and familiar. Claire shook her head lightly. "I considered it. I am glad you stayed." For the first time all evening, genuine amusement softened her expression. "Traffic?" she asked. He laughed quietly. "A delayed flight and 2 hours on the interstate. Not exactly my best entrance." Claire noticed a few nearby guests glancing toward them. Most were simply curious. To everyone else, they looked like two people catching up after a long day. No one seemed to recognize the significance of the moment. The stranger extended his hand toward her champagne flute. "May I?" Claire handed it to him. He set it carefully on a nearby table beside his own untouched glass. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, yet it carried the kind of attentiveness Claire had once believed only existed in movies. "You look beautiful tonight," he said. There was no performance in the compliment. No audience. No agenda. Just sincerity. Claire felt herself smile again. Across the room, Ethan noticed. His conversation ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. The woman speaking with him followed his gaze. "Who is that?" she asked. Ethan narrowed his eyes. No idea. Yet the answer bothered him. He was accustomed to knowing. Everyone worth knowing at events like this. The stranger did not fit into any category he recognized. Meanwhile, Claire and the man continued talking near the marble column. They spoke easily, as though silence between them never felt uncomfortable. "How was Denver?" Claire asked. "Busy. That means exhausting. Usually." He smiled. "But seeing you makes it worth the trip." The simplicity of the statement caught her off guard. For a brief moment, the ballroom noise faded into the background. The years she spent rebuilding her life had taught her something important. Real confidence never demanded attention. Real kindness never announced itself. The strongest people often entered a room without needing to own it. Ethan finally walked closer, unable to ignore the situation any longer. Several guests noticed and discreetly turned their attention toward the developing interaction. Claire sensed him approaching before he spoke. "Looks like you have company," Ethan said. The stranger turned politely. His expression remained relaxed. "Good evening." Ethan offered a measured smile. "Ethan Brooks." "Alexander Hayes," the man replied. They shook hands. Nothing about the exchange appeared unusual. Yet something flickered across Ethan's face. Not recognition. Curiosity. The name sounded familiar, but he could not immediately place it. Alexander released the handshake and returned his attention to Claire. It was a subtle gesture, but everyone nearby noticed. Ethan was accustomed to being the center of conversations. Alexander seemed completely uninterested in competing for attention. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Around them, the ballroom lights reflected against crystal chandeliers and polished glass. The music continued. Guests mingled. Yet a quiet tension was beginning to form beneath the elegance of the evening. Claire could feel it. Ethan could feel it. And somewhere deep inside, Ethan was starting to realize that the story he had been telling himself about Claire Bennett might not be true anymore. The handshake lasted only a moment, but the effect lingered. Ethan stepped back with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He searched his memory. Again. Alexander Hayes. The name felt familiar, like a song he could almost remember but could not place. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Claire noticed it immediately. She had spent years learning how to read Ethan's expressions. Long before anyone else recognized his frustration, she could see it forming beneath the surface. "Well," Ethan said, straightening his jacket, "it was nice meeting you, Alexander." "Likewise," Alexander replied. There was no challenge in his voice. No attempt to compete. If anything, his calmness made Ethan seem even more restless. As Ethan walked away, Claire exhaled softly. Alexander glanced toward her. "Rough evening?" he asked. "You could say that. Do you want to leave?" Claire looked around the ballroom. A year ago, she probably would have. Maybe even 6 months ago. But tonight felt different. "No," she said after a moment. "I think I want to stay." A faint smile crossed Alexander's face. "Good. They moved toward a quieter corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Outside, thousands of lights stretched across the darkness like scattered stars. Cars moved along distant highways in steady streams of red and white. The city never seemed to sleep. Neither, Claire thought, did opportunity. They talked easily. About travel. About work. About the absurd delays at airports. Nothing dramatic. Nothing designed to impress. Yet each conversation revealed the same thing. Alexander listened. Truly listened. When Claire spoke, he paid attention to the details. He remembered things. Small things. The kind of things most people forgot. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Ethan found himself distracted from every conversation. A business associate was explaining a potential investment opportunity, but Ethan barely heard a word. His attention kept drifting back toward Claire and Alexander. They were laughing now. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just naturally. It unsettled him. He remembered a time when Claire used to laugh like that with him. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped noticing. "You seem distracted," the associate finally said. Ethan forced a smile. Long day. But even he knew it sounded weak. Near the windows, Claire was telling Alexander about a small coffee shop she had opened after the divorce. It was not a huge success story by corporate standards. Just a comfortable neighborhood business with loyal customers and steady growth. Yet when she described it, her eyes brightened. Alexander listened with genuine interest. "You built that yourself?" he asked. "Mostly." "That is impressive." Claire laughed softly. Most people would not call a coffee shop impressive. Most people measure success with the wrong ruler. The answer caught her off guard. For a second, she simply looked at him. There it was again. That quiet certainty. The absence of ego. The feeling that he saw value in things others overlooked. A server passed by with fresh drinks. Alexander thanked him by name after glancing at his badge. The young man looked surprised and smiled before continuing on. Claire noticed. She always noticed things like that. Respect revealed character more clearly than charm ever could. Across the room, Ethan watched another burst of laughter between them. The irritation in his chest deepened. He did not know who Alexander Hayes was. He did not know why Claire seemed happier than she had in years. And perhaps most frustrating of all, he could not understand why the room itself seemed slowly shifting around them. More guests were beginning to notice Alexander. A few whispered quietly after passing him. Others offered polite nods of recognition. Yet nobody approached directly. It was as though they were trying to confirm something before speaking. Ethan caught fragments of conversations drifting through the crowd. A familiar name. A company. A private jet. A board meeting. None of it made complete sense yet. But somewhere in the ballroom, a secret was beginning to surface. And Claire was the only person who seemed completely unsurprised by it. The whispers were no longer isolated. They moved through the ballroom like a slow current beneath the surface of a calm lake. Claire noticed them. Alexander noticed them. Ethan definitely noticed them. Every few minutes another guest would glance in Alexander's direction, hesitate for a moment, then continue walking. Some looked surprised. Others looked uncertain. A few appeared almost nervous. Yet no one approached directly. It was as if they were all trying to confirm the same thought before saying it aloud. Ethan decided he had seen enough. If Alexander Hayes was going to become the center of attention, Ethan intended to reclaim the spotlight first. He gathered several colleagues near one of the larger cocktail tables and raised his voice just enough to carry. "Business has been incredible this year," he announced. "We closed our biggest quarter yet." The group responded with polite congratulations. Ethan smiled wider. I am actually looking at a second vacation property. Somewhere near the coast. Maybe Florida. Maybe California. More compliments followed. He welcomed every one of them. Across the room, Claire listened without reacting. The performance felt familiar. Years ago, she would have felt embarrassed for him. Tonight, she simply felt distant from it. Ethan continued. Success is funny. People spend years talking about what they are going to do. Then one day you realize you actually did it. He laughed at his own remark. Several guests smiled politely. Others exchanged subtle glances. Something about the conversation felt forced. The more Ethan tried to showcase his accomplishments, the more obvious it became that he wanted someone specific to hear them. Claire remained near the windows with Alexander, completely uninterested in competing. You know what I learned after 40? Alexander said quietly. What? Most people spend too much energy trying to look successful and not enough energy trying to be useful. Claire laughed softly. That sounds like experience talking. It is. Painful experience. Usually the expensive kind. The two shared a smile. Their conversation flowed naturally while Ethan's became increasingly theatrical. A few minutes later, he began describing a luxury vehicle he had recently purchased. Then a private golf club membership. Then a new executive title. Each achievement sounded impressive on its own. Together, they began sounding like a resume delivered at a dinner party. Guests nodded politely, but their attention wandered. Some looked toward Alexander again. One older gentleman standing near the bar suddenly froze. His eyes narrowed as he studied Alexander's profile. No, he murmured under his breath. The woman beside him followed his gaze. Her expression changed immediately. Is that really him? She whispered. The gentleman did not answer. He simply continued watching. Nearby, another guest appeared to reach the same conclusion. Then another. The pattern spread quietly through the room. Claire could feel the atmosphere shifting. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like pressure building before a storm. Yet Alexander remained completely unaffected. He asked about her coffee shop's expansion plans. He listened carefully as she described a second location she hoped to open next year. Not once did he mention himself. Not once did he encourage the growing attention around him. That, more than anything, fascinated Claire. Ethan finally noticed that people were no longer fully engaged in his stories. Their focus kept drifting elsewhere. His smile tightened. His confidence began showing small cracks. Then he heard a fragment of conversation from behind him. Hayes Global Holdings. Another voice responded. It cannot be. Ethan turned sharply. The name struck him instantly. For a brief second, the ballroom seemed unusually quiet. He knew that company. Everyone in business knew that company. His eyes moved slowly across the room until they landed on Alexander again. This time, the name did not feel familiar. This time, it felt dangerous. The realization did not arrive all at once. It spread across Ethan's face in stages. First confusion. Then recognition. Then disbelief. Hayes Global Holdings was not some regional company. It was one of the largest private investment groups in the country, with interests spanning technology, logistics, real estate, and energy. Ethan had read articles about its acquisitions. He had watched interviews with executives discussing billion-dollar transactions. He had even referenced the company during presentations to clients. Yet somehow, standing only a few feet away from Alexander Hayes earlier that evening, he had failed to make the connection. Across the ballroom, the whispers were becoming conversations. Guests who had been hesitant now appeared increasingly certain. A woman near the bar quietly opened a news article on her phone. An older investor nodded after seeing the photograph on the screen. Another guest suddenly excused himself from a conversation and walked toward Alexander. "Mr. Hayes," he said respectfully. "I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to say it is an honor to meet you." Claire watched the interaction with calm amusement. Alexander stood and shook the man's hand. "Please, call me Alexander." "Of course." The man smiled nervously. "Your work with the Chicago Education Initiative was remarkable." "Thank you. That project means a lot to me." The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet when it ended, everyone nearby had heard enough. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Naturally. Like a puzzle finally locking into place. More guests began approaching. Some introduced themselves. Others simply offered greetings. Through it all, Alexander remained exactly the same. No change in posture. No change in tone. No visible interest in the attention. Ethan watched every second of it. The confidence he had displayed all evening was fading quickly. He remembered every joke he had made. Every smug comment directed at Claire. Every assumption he had carried into the room. None of them felt particularly impressive anymore. Nearby, a business associate leaned toward him. "You know him?" Ethan hesitated. "Not really. That is Alexander Hayes." "I know." The associate raised his eyebrows. "Then you know who you have been standing next to all evening." Ethan did not answer. Because the truth was even worse. He had not been standing next to Alexander. Claire had. While Ethan spent the evening trying to prove his success, Claire had quietly been sharing a conversation with one of the most influential businessmen in America. Near the windows, Alexander finally returned his attention fully to Claire. "I am sorry about that," he said. "For what?" "The interruption." Claire laughed softly. "You mean the growing crowd?" Alexander glanced around. "Something like that. You seem uncomfortable." "I prefer normal conversations." "You should have thought about that before becoming famous." For the first time all evening, Alexander laughed loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. The sound felt genuine. Unfiltered. Claire smiled. She had always admired that about him. His success never seemed to define him. It was simply one part of a much larger person. Across the room, Ethan noticed something he had missed before. Claire was not impressed by Alexander's wealth. She was comfortable with him. Relaxed around him. The ease between them could not be explained by money or status. It came from trust. From friendship. From something deeper that had developed long before this evening. That realization struck harder than any revelation about business success. Then Alexander's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. "Excuse me for 1 minute." He stepped a few feet away to take the call. Claire remained near the windows, watching the city lights below. Ethan looked at her for several seconds before finally walking in her direction. This time, there was no audience he wanted to impress. No performance left to give. Just questions he suddenly needed answered. The city lights reflected across the glass as Claire stood quietly near the windows. For a moment, she simply enjoyed the stillness. The evening had become far more dramatic than she expected, yet she felt strangely detached from the attention surrounding it. Years ago, she might have measured her worth through the eyes of people around her. Tonight, she did not need anyone's approval. Footsteps approached. She already knew who it was. Ethan stopped beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt different now. Less hostile. More uncertain. Finally, Ethan looked toward the skyline and said, "You never told me." Claire glanced at him. "Told you what?" He hesitated. "About Alexander." A faint smile touched her lips. "You never asked." Ethan let out a slow breath. For the first time all evening, there was no arrogance in his voice. Only curiosity. How long have you known him? Claire considered the question. A little over 3 years. Ethan turned toward her. 3 years? Yes. The answer seemed to surprise him. 3 years. Long enough for trust to grow. Long enough for friendship to become something meaningful. Long enough to realize that genuine character often revealed itself when nobody was watching. Ethan stared across the ballroom where several prominent guests were now speaking with Alexander. One executive. Then another. A well-known investor. A foundation director. People who rarely approached anyone first were waiting patiently for a chance to speak with him. Yet Alexander continued treating each person exactly the same. No special performance. No display of power. Just simple courtesy. I do not understand, Ethan admitted. Claire looked at him calmly. What exactly do you not understand? Someone like him. Ethan paused. Why would he? He stopped before finishing the sentence. Claire already understood. Why would someone like Alexander choose someone like her? The question hung silently between them. Years ago, those words might have wounded her. Tonight, they only made her sad. Not for herself. For Ethan. Because she suddenly realized how little he understood about the things that truly mattered. Because he sees people differently, Claire answered softly. Ethan frowned. Before he could respond, movement near the center of the ballroom drew everyone's attention. The host of the event had stepped onto the small stage. A microphone crackled briefly before the room settled into silence. Ladies and gentlemen, the host announced, before we conclude tonight's celebration, there is one guest I would like to recognize. Several people immediately turned toward Alexander. Ethan noticed it. Claire noticed it too. The host smiled. Many of you already know him. Others may only know his companies, his charitable foundations, or the thousands of jobs created through his leadership. The ballroom grew even quieter. It is a privilege to welcome Alexander Hayes. Applause erupted throughout the room. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. Guests rose from their seats. Some smiled. Others nodded respectfully. A few even looked starstruck. Alexander appeared mildly uncomfortable as he accepted the attention. He shook his head once as though wishing the spotlight would move elsewhere. Yet the host continued. Over the past decade, Mr. Hayes has built one of the most successful private investment organizations in the nation, while supporting educational programs, community development projects, and small business initiatives across dozens of cities. More applause followed. Ethan stood frozen. Hearing the details spoken aloud transformed suspicion into reality. This was not simply a wealthy businessman. This was one of the most influential people in the room. Perhaps in several rooms across the country. Then came the moment that changed everything. The host smiled toward Claire. And I should also thank the remarkable woman standing beside him tonight. Alexander often says that some of the best business advice he has ever received came from a coffee shop owner who taught him more about people than any boardroom ever could. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward Claire. Alexander looked directly at her and smiled. Not because she completed his image. Not because she elevated his status. But because he genuinely respected her. And in that instant, Ethan finally understood what he had lost. For a few seconds, Claire wished the spotlight would move somewhere else. Hundreds of eyes rested on her as the applause continued through the ballroom. She felt the warmth of embarrassment rise to her cheeks, but beside her, Alexander offered the same calm smile he always did whenever life became complicated. It was not a smile that demanded attention. It simply reminded her to breathe. Eventually the applause faded. Conversations slowly returned. Glasses clinked. Music resumed. Yet the atmosphere had changed permanently. The room no longer saw Claire as Ethan's former wife. They saw her as herself. Someone respected. Someone valued. Someone whose story extended far beyond a marriage that had ended years ago. Alexander stepped down from the stage and returned to her side. "I should apologize," he said quietly. Claire laughed. "For what?" "I did not know he was going to mention you." "I figured that out." "Are you upset?" She shook her head. "No. Just surprised." Alexander nodded. "Good." Then, without another word, he handed her a glass of sparkling water and the two shared a small laugh. The simplicity of the moment felt strangely perfect. Across the ballroom, Ethan watched them. For the first time all evening, he was not thinking about money. Not thinking about status. Not thinking about success. He was thinking about something much harder to measure. Respect. The kind that could not be purchased. The kind that had to be earned over years of character and consistency. He realized that nobody admired Claire because of Alexander. They admired her because of the person she had become. Alexander simply happened to recognize it first. After several minutes, Ethan finally walked over. His steps were slower now. More thoughtful. Claire noticed him approaching. Alexander did too. Ethan stopped in front of them and looked at Claire. For a moment, it seemed as though he wanted to say 100 different things. Excuses. Explanations. Regrets. None of them arrived. "You look happy," he said instead. Claire studied him for a second before answering. "I am." Ethan nodded. The response carried no bitterness. No attempt to prove anything. Just truth. Somehow that made it more powerful. He glanced toward Alexander. "Take care of her." Alexander smiled politely. "I plan to." Ethan managed a faint laugh. "I believe you." For the first time all evening, there was no tension between them. No competition. Only acceptance. Ethan looked back at Claire one last time. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Claire could hear the sincerity in his voice. Years ago, she might have needed that apology. Tonight, she did not. The wound had healed long before he acknowledged it. "I hope you are happy too, Ethan," she said softly. The word surprised him. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were genuine. Claire was not trying to win. She had already moved beyond that. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, then nodded. "Thank you." A few minutes later, guests began leaving the ballroom. The city skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls. Staff cleared tables. The music softened. The evening was coming to an end. Alexander offered Claire his hand. She took it. Together they walked toward the grand entrance beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Neither hurried. Neither looked back immediately. At the doorway, Claire paused for a moment and glanced over her shoulder. Ethan stood near the center of the ballroom speaking quietly with a colleague. The spotlight was gone. The attention had faded. Life was already moving forward. Claire smiled and turned away. The doors closed gently behind her and Alexander as they stepped into the cool night air. The city stretched before them, full of possibilities she once thought she had lost forever. Years earlier, she had walked away from a broken chapter believing she had failed. Tonight she finally understood the truth. She had never needed revenge. She had never needed validation. She had never needed to prove anyone wrong. The greatest victory was becoming someone she was proud to be. And as the lights of the city reflected across the sidewalk ahead, Claire Bennett walked forward without carrying the weight of the past. She did not win him back. She won herself.